and welcome to another episode of Application Development Today. My name is Don Jackson. I'm your host. I'm also a chief technologist here at OpenText. Today's topic is Know Your Code, and I'm pleased to have with me two new guests, first-time visitors to featured guests to our series here, Miss Erica Leifgert and Mr. Julian Fish. Erica, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. First-time guest, long-time listener. I feel like that was necessary. I've been around with the set of companies that have been acquired along the way for a little over 23 years now. So I go back to the days of Change Band ES and early PBCS and Dimension CM. And so happy to share some knowledge today or chat on the topic wherever this conversation takes us today.
Awesome. And you, Julian?
Yeah, thanks, Don, and thanks for hosting today, and thanks everyone for joining us, watching. I guess the year 2000 was a very good year in the world of software. Both Erica and I joined a company at the same time, slightly different companies that then came together and then came into OpenText. But yeah, it's been a long while since I've been in the space of coding, development, execution, CI, CD, DevOps. I'm just saying words now. But yeah, I work here at OpenText as Director of Product Management for a number of our products, and looking forward to taking part in this fun and entertaining chat session that we've got lined up.
Awesome. Thanks, Julian. And just so you guys know, right, we have this thing on the podcast series, DYA, define your acronym. Somebody during their introduction used a couple of acronyms there and didn't define them.
Yes, it's going to have to throw me off the podcast already. Yes.
That's right. CI, continuous integration, CI, continuous
delivery, CI, continuous integration,
or deployment.
And DevOps, the amalgamation of development and operations.
Yeah. So thanks for taking the time out today, guys. Have a little fun there. I'm just going to start this off with knowing your code, and there's one thing that I like to do. There's a little bit of sarcasm if you can't tell in this one. You mean open source artifacts aren't secure? What are you talking about? Let you guys weigh in on why is it important to know your code?
You know, I think I'll kick it off because I when we started talking about this topic way back when we heard the term open source, we thought of it as a competing product. There was open source tools that companies were moving towards as software development was becoming commoditized. Nowadays, I think that open source is more of a I almost see developers as being quilt artists. They're piecing together different pieces of software that they have found or have been identified in order to escalate their development and be able to meet the needs of the business. And I think that is more along the lines of the topic that we're talking, of course. It is fascinating to me, the number of companies. I think it's almost right, somewhere between like 95 and 100% of companies that use open source software components in their software development today. And I think it's even above 70% in some cases of the amount of code that's in, say, a code base that is open source. So it is an important topic for us, obviously, and important to know how much you have, because there are some risks there.
Yeah, you think about the Log4j vulnerabilities, and there were people like, that hit the fan and the proverbial fan, and people were like, do we have Log4j in our applications? I don't know. Do we? I don't know. Right? They start talking to each other. They start doing the pointing fingers, right? Do you know? Do you know? Do you know? And yeah, it just didn't happen. That people didn't know.
Yeah, it's always that great question of so what is it? And where is it, and where does it get used, and to put it into real world terms, every one of us is probably engaged with open source software today, be that from turning on your television and your set-top box, and the fact that there are components in that, anything that's probably based upon a Java framework is using open source. If you're interacting with your laptop, watching this, open source components in use. If you've clicked on that wonderful device that we all carry around with us at all times and check at the places we shouldn't be checking it, that wonderful mobile device, open source components embedded into that. So the reality is open source is a way of life for all of us. It makes developers' lives easier. And as is always the case, things that make life easier aren't necessarily the best for us. You have to be very careful about where things come from. You wouldn't go to a shady-looking locksmith and say, "Hey, can you change these keys for my front door, please?" And the guy who's just stood by the side of the road with a piece of putty saying, "Yeah, of course I can do that for you. I'll be right back." No, you want to make sure you go to somewhere reputable, and it's the same with open source software. Yeah, you don't want to just be picking up the open source components off the internet somewhere just because it popped up in your search and then embedding that into your application, because it can cause you problems. And we'll talk more about that as we progress.
But even a reputable distributor could cause issues that are unknown now, that could crop up later. As we found with that Log4j, it was acceptable many years ago until somebody found something to exploit, and then you needed a way to find out if you had it or not.
Yep, and you talk about, it's interesting that you mentioned locksmith. One of the things that I think about, keeping your code under lock and key, right? What's one of the most common open source things that software that's used in development, right, is Git, right? And because it, wonderful version control, except there's I don't want to spill the beans, right? But is there something that Git has, because the whole idea of version control is history and the changes are immutable and I can go back and compare everything. Is there something that Git is missing?
Well, if we think about the purpose of Git, it was to allow people to collaborate. So it met the need of what they were intending to do. However, the person behind Git was even a little bit more protective of what went into his main source code, and he was the final approver and merger, if you will, of the stuff that went into the main baseline. So yes, there are definitely things in Git that allow you to go back and change who delivered something, so that maybe Linus Torvalds could put his name on something rather than it being Julian Fish saying, "I've got this great widget to put into Linux." There's the proliferation that everybody has that source code on their desktops that also creates problems, from just my laptop gets stolen and now somebody has access to that code. So, I mean, it's the way we work now. We have to have additional layers of security to help us prevent things from getting out on the internet. But it's definitely not a good safe for putting your source code in.
Yeah, it's not a digital safe. What?
No.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So
it's
I
kind of interesting.
I hear like a word of wisdom here, right? And we talk about at the end that there's always words of wisdom. It sounds like Erica just gave us a word of wisdom. Is you really need to investigate whether out of the box, is it even in a box at this point? If it's open source, is there a box? I don't know. But out of the box, Git, is it sufficient for your needs? Right? There are especially if you're thinking in a regulated space, the mutability of some of the history elements might not be okay with auditors. Just saying, right? It's something that you guys so an Erica word of wisdom there, right? Is check out if you're going to use Git, make sure you either lay something on top of it to plug those gaps or pick something else. I'm sorry, Julian, you were going to say something.
No, it's all good, Don. I was just going to say it's not even just the pure play open source Gits that can potentially leave you exposed. You guys have done a great job explaining the notion of mutability and people changing commit messages or commit codes or committer IDs, things like that. Well, what about the commercial offerings in the space? What about the big players that everyone knows and loves? Well, there are ways to prevent immutability from causing issues. One of the other challenges that I've seen, I remember I gave a talk to a number of government agencies, worryingly, just before everyone went into lockdown for COVID a couple of years back. And the night before, I was thinking, well, I'm going to try and prove a point around the security of some of these Git-based repositories. So I went onto the internet and I did a brief trawl into one of the major Git repos. And literally within 25 minutes of me starting work on this, I found about 200 unsecured Git repositories that contained information about how to access things like ticketing systems for those government sites, how to access submission portals for those government sites, and even some of the source code, which was kind of amusing when I presented it the next day and said, oh, by the way, you probably want to lock these systems down. Security when it comes to IP and source code is critical. It's your crown jewels. It's not a ticketing system that's driving change through your system. This is the core base of your business, and knowing your code and knowing what's in your code and knowing how your code is managed and knowing how to protect your code. That's the key to making sure that you have a sustainable business, not just today, but in the future as well. Because I'm sure we'll touch on this. There are some severe implications for including things that shouldn't be included in your code base.
So how do I know what's in my code, right? How do I know that?
Oh, am I supposed to stop again? Everybody's giving me the sign. I guess right? I'm supposed to start with the responses. Sorry, I was trying to share the floor.
So, I mean, there's some regulation around this, right? And software bill of materials, but how do you manage that, right? How do you manage an SBOM, a software bill of materials?
Yeah, there are tools that developers can utilize in order to create that bill of materials to ensure that what is delivered into the repository is or contains just approved items, or that the items that they are delivering go through an approval process if there isn't something, if they're introducing something new into the repository. Once you have that stored, it's kind of like a database, kind of like your IT infrastructure CMDB, if you will. It has the list of items where you can then be able to go back and do that query against all your applications. Do I have this log4j file that I'm utilizing? A lot of companies use other sources, for validating some of those open source components, like an NPM. But like I said before, they may also have, at least initially, that version, and it may be approved until somebody starts exploiting it. So you've got to stay on top of that as far as making sure that just because it was in one version and it was good, 6 months, 9 months, a year and a half later, that now may be exploited and be no longer a safe component to use.
And I'm gonna hit you up there, Erica. There's a couple of acronyms you use there. CMDB.
Configuration Management Database.
And NPM, I think is what you said?
Oh gosh, I don't have that off the top of my head. I don't know if you have that one, Julian. I just know it as a repository like a Maven and to get open source components.
Yeah, it's a package manager, and it's designed to help you pull down components from some location, normally on the internet, used a lot in Linux distributions, and it allows you to pull those packages down and install them. And then the question is, where are those packages coming from? Is it a known source? Is it a trusted source? To Erica's point, it is the version that you're pulling down and you're including in your product. Because let's break it down a little bit more. When we're talking about open source code and security, we're talking about it in the context and the construct of a product, an application, something that you're going to be running either on your machine or something that's running in the cloud and you're accessing via a browser, and the code that goes into that application. the components that you build yourself, the IP, the intellectual property. I missed out on that one earlier on, but there we go. The intellectual property that you're running yourself and you're writing yourself that make up the application, and those third-party libraries that come in. They're the third-party, maybe open source components that you're pulling down from some known location. The version of those components, just like Erica said, is really important. You may find that you have the last but one version of that component included in your application, which sounds okay. It's still the same component. Everything's cool. I've got this, component. I always talk about this specific component called Jackson Data Bind. It allows us to pull things together. It's a specific library or a specific class that allows us to do that. And the reality is, if you use the last but one version, you get some severe security warnings. There are ways that people can do things like malicious code injections using the library, and there's known vulnerabilities that people, if they really wanted to, malicious people, nasty people could take advantage of. So running not just and having an understanding not just of what's in your application, your own code, your open source code, the components of that open source code, and then the versions of the open source code are really, really important. And then being able to constantly validate that those versions that you're running are still secure is really, really important. It stops people from taking advantage of your application in malicious ways and maybe doing something that has brand or product or organizational impact further down the line.
So all of those should be managed, I would assume, in your SBOM, your software bill of materials, right? The version, what components, what intellectual property components there are as well. But I would assume that there's somebody. One would think that then there's somebody who, at the end of the day, needs to review all of this and make sure that it's all proper before something goes live, before the release goes out, right? So how does an enterprise make sure to do that? What do we do to make sure that this is all happening?
Yeah, ideally, like we say with everything in software development, shift left, right? You want it to happen early in the process, because the later we find it, the more it's going to cost us to resolve that issue. If we've already built around this component that's now suspect and we're getting ready to go into production, we now have a whole lot of stuff that we have to fix to resolve it. So enforcing that early on in the process by a couple of methods. First of all, having an approval process of these are the approved components, so that when your developers go to pull things down, they're pulling it from your approved cached repository. The other aspect to think about is they may need something new that you don't have in your repository already. So having an approval process. Now, maybe there are some things that if the licensing checks out, the repository that you're going to, like Maven says, there's no extreme vulnerabilities. If it meets a minimum criteria, you can maybe automatically approve that, which simplifies things and enables that process to move quickly. But there are other situations where that's not the case. So that may, when that developer delivers into the repository, you need a process in order to flag that, identify that component, and have it reviewed so that it can either be accepted into the repository and put into your known cache, or rejected, and then the developer needs to go back, and then that's happening early on in the process.
Yeah, so you're really talking about having a good release management process, but that release management process needs to start at the beginning. It shouldn't be a afterthought at the end of just final sign off, right? So I used to have to go to these huge, I can't remember what we called them. They're essentially change management meetings, right? And everybody who had a change going in across the over 1,200 applications we had to sit there and present their change. It was a painful 4-hour meeting. And everybody had to sign off on yeah, okay, that's not going to interfere with our stuff. But that's not the end all of the release management process, right? That has to start way early in the beginning. You need to have a process for bringing in new software libraries. You need to have all these different processes and what it takes to do that. But there's also the aspect of tracing that, right? So how do you trace that? To ensure that when Lord forbid you get audited and the auditor says, hey, prove to me that you followed your processes.
Yeah, I think one of the key areas around this, and one of the things that's really starting to come to the fore, we've seen Gartner, Forrester, IDC talking around this shift that's happening in the world of product delivery and in the world of product development, application delivery management. That's easier for me to say. What we've started to see is this shift from individual tools that are maybe best of breed for components of that end-to-end process that you mentioned, that starting with the code and then going into the build and then going into the test validation and then going into the deployment and execution and then going into the release process and all of the substeps that happen there, the validation of the libraries, the security scans and checks, the code style checks. Every one of those different domains that I just mentioned has tools and technologies that are available to support them. Over the last 10, 15 years, definitely since Patrick Dubois pushed out the whole notion of DevOps 2010, we've seen a shift to best of breed point products for those areas. What we're starting to see now is that the administrative burden and overhead of keeping those tools aligned and keeping those tools up to date and keeping all of the components of every single step in lockstep for delivery is really, really taxing. And a lot of organizations, and like I mentioned, the Gartners, the Forresters, the IDCs are definitely shifting their direction towards this notion of a end-to-end set of capabilities or engineering platforms, integrated software delivery platforms, or some form of set of capabilities that brings all of those components together, because it's easier to look in one place than to look in 5, 6, or 10 different places to identify where these problems are arising. Maybe the library that we've added isn't secure. Well, how do we know it's not secure? A different system told us. Where do we get the information from that different? Proving that to an auditor is incredibly time consuming. Whereas if everything's in a single platform, if this platform engineering play actually turns into something real, we can say, well, go to the platform, I'll click this button, I'll provide this report. Maybe it's even an AI-powered report. And from that report, we'll be able to say, hey, this is all of the steps that we went to. This is all of the component and intellectual material that was included. And this is how we can prove that nothing was manipulated or changed or updated on the way. So really securing that system and then giving us an ability to provide audit, compliance, control, and governance, which, let's be honest, if you're a major or a minor software or engineering organization, is really key to the success of your business.
Well, every business now is a software company, right? Mm-hmm. I think anybody who thinks that they're not needs to understand how phones work, right? Because you're going to have an app, right? Now you may outsource some of that capability, but and we talk about being ambassador of your brand, right? You're all ambassadors of your brand, and the software is an ambassador of your brand as well. So you have to make sure that's in there. I think another thing that you touched on here that we've talked a lot about the audit implications and the ability to respond to an audit and some of those reactive connotations as well. I think part of this too is to start thinking about the total cost of ownership of whatever it is. So having this demarcation of tool sets, bringing all these best of breed tools instead of a platform, there's a huge total cost of ownership that from the business perspective you need to look into as well. It's not just how quickly can I respond, but it's also how much is it costing. You talked about the labor to be able to administer and the administrative overhead of all these tools, right? There's a cost to that, and you should be tracking that and justifying that. Anytime that you want to bring in a new best of breed solution, you should be handling that. So, one last question, and then I'll wrap it up for parting thoughts. Is there are I looked out on the tracking tool, and I'm not going to use the acronym because I can't remember what the acronym stands for. CPE. I can't remember what the exact acronym stands for, and I'll have to go look it up afterwards and supply it to the production guys so they can save me on the back end. But there are over 40,000 CPE vulnerabilities for 2023 as of the beginning of August. Mm-hmm. That's an amazing amount. How does a software company how do you handle that, right? Because we're all software companies now. How does an enterprise handle that? How do I make sure that okay, I need Log4j capabilities. So which version of Log4j do I have to have on there? Maybe I'm using Faker.js, right? Well, there was a huge Faker.js problem in order to create synthetic data for my test environment. How do I handle all of this at this point now?
Yeah, I think it's processes and procedures. Probably a couple of things that developers don't like to hear too frequently. They didn't like, being put into, well, there needs to be sign-offs before we put your stuff into production. Well, sometimes these things are necessary, especially when it comes to legal ramifications. We've talked about security vulnerabilities, but there's also the legal licensing of many of these components, and you start putting that into a piece of code base that you're going to then resell, that could have implications that could put you out of business really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So having those processes that control those components that you're adding into the code base early on when you're delivering that code initially, that's where the tracking has to begin, and it has to be more than just the developer involved. I realize little components make things easy, and they typically have the desire that, oh, I'll just put this in, or, oh, I'll just, write these 2 lines of code to stitch these 2 quick things together and everything will work. It may be good for that first 30 seconds. It's the downstream stuff, that macro picture that they need to take into consideration that they could be putting at risk.
Yeah, I think know your code. It's the key. Having the understanding of the libraries that are included, having a secure vault that tracks which versions of your libraries are in use in which applications, in which components, knowing that there are vulnerabilities or no vulnerabilities in those specific libraries at specific versions, and having approvals to prevent users from placing the vulnerable libraries into your code. It's a big step towards, okay, we're going to minimize the impact and we're going to maximize the efficiency and the output of our teams.
Yeah, because you've got to find it quickly. If that is in a code base that you have running in the cloud somewhere, that could be, losing money drastically, if that's been exposed. So it's not just a matter of tracking it. It's how quickly can you get to that to resolve that.
And I'll just do the shameless self-plug. We at OpenText have solutions that can help you with that. Sorry. So I try not to mention products on here, right? So, but certainly to speed up, right? Digitization of these processes and the ability to find things quickly, as you mentioned, Erica, is absolutely paramount. You think about. I used to have to quantify at one of the companies I worked for. I had to quantify downtime, right? How much, and we got down to the second, right? Each second of downtime is this tens of thousands of dollars. That's when you're talking about mission critical applications for a large enterprise. That's realistic. Yes, digitizing those processes and having a digital solution to be able to search through and find things to reduce that mean time to resolution of whatever the issue is, and to be able to find it fastly to react to audit requests as well. So I want to thank you guys for joining today. It's an interesting topic. There's a lot to it, and we're just scratching the surface. But I want to give you guys a chance for parting thoughts. And since we did introductions from left, right, top to bottom on my screen, we're going to do parting thoughts the opposite way. So Julian, any parting thoughts or Julian's words of wisdoms that you'd like, words of wisdom that you would like to impart on us?
Yeah, to the topic area, know your code, and tied into that, think for the future. Think of the future of execution and delivery, and where organizations will be in 3 to 5 years' time. This whole platform-centric approach to product delivery, which reduces complexity, it reduces cost, it improves efficiency, and removes waste. And if you take that approach, you're on to a winner.
Awesome. Thank you for those. And then Erica, any more EWOWs? Erica's words of wisdom? My
EWOW is going to be, there's always a cost to free.
That's really a powerful one and very succinct. That's awesome. I would always say, free isn't free, right? There's always a cost, right? Doing it, getting into, and maybe this is a Don word of wisdom here, right? Is understanding your total cost of ownership, your TCO, and of whatever solution you're putting in place or whatever process you have in there is actually really important, because then if you're the type of person who wants to bring in something to increase your efficiency, if you have been tracking what your total cost of ownership has been, the business case becomes very easy. Those of you watching this, feel free to provide comments. If you have other topics that you'd like to hear, once again, this was another one that was suggested from somebody. Feel free to email me at djackson3@opentext.com. And once again, thank you, Erica. Thank you, Julian, for taking the time out of your day to enlighten us on the topic of knowing your code.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
If you liked the video, please click the like button. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when we release new videos.